Today's conversation is brought to you by Brotherhood Mutual Insurance Company. Offering health benefits is a proven strategy toward finding and retaining top talent, yet the administrative burden and high costs may leave your ministry budget feeling stressed. It's time to get a second opinion. Brotherhood Mutual can help you find quality health plans for your ministry staff that are customizable, flexible, and affordable, including many with tax-saving opportunities. Click Brotherhood Mutual in the show notes and explore options for 2025.
Today's conversation is the podcast of the National Association of Evangelicals. I'm your host, Walter Kim, NAE President. In these conversations, we seek to help evangelicals foster thriving communities and navigate complexity with biblical clarity. Bonnie Kristian, Editorial Director of Ideas and Books at Christianity Today, argues that today we are facing a knowledge crisis that is breaking our brains, polluting our politics, and corrupting Christian community. What can we do about it? This conversation with Bonnie is timely, challenging, and helpful. Listen in. Bonnie, thanks so much for joining us today. I've been following you for many years and have really been grateful for your keen insights on a lot of different topics.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So you're a journalist, author, also a trained theologian. That's not necessarily a common combination. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah, well, a trained theologian is very flattering. I don't know if I'd go quite that far myself, but I did go to seminary. So I knew from a pretty young age that I wanted to get into writing and to write about politics and current events. Even in like 8th grade, I knew that my fiction was not good. And so I majored in political science in college, and I spent a few years in the DC area working in political nonprofits, doing like communications work, come to our events, here's our happy hour, this kind of thing. And after a few years of that, I realized that I really wanted to be writing about the ideas that our organizations were promoting and not like the organizational work itself. And I came to the conclusion that I needed an advanced degree to do that the way that I wanted. Particularly, I was interested in writing about the intersection of religion and politics and theology, and also foreign policy. And so having already sort of done the politics thing in my undergraduate degree, and for a few years, I decided to go to seminary. And so it was while I was in seminary that I really began getting into journalism, gradually building up a portfolio and contacts while I was in school. And then by the time I graduated, I moved into journalism full time.
So the theological interest, the training, did that shift how you thought about the work of journalism?
I don't know that it did really. I mean, significantly, my interest in seminary was a very practical calculation of I knew that I wanted to write books, and for nonfiction, you need credentials, right? So that was, if I'm honest, a big part of it. Obviously, I had interest in the what I was learning as well. I think an interesting thing about having gone to seminary and then going into the world of journalism is that there are many Christians have this idea, I think, that the like mainstream media in particular is biased against us, particularly biased against evangelicals. And what I have found, now I'm at Christianity Today, but previously working in secular mainstream newsrooms, what I have found is that, in my experience at least, it's really not so much bias as it is sheer ignorance. It is not uncommon to be the only person in the room who's ever gone to church. Like, people just don't know what they don't know. And so, for instance, I spent many years at an outlet called The Week, and I was the only evangelical on our team. And so stories about evangelicals would come out and be like, Bonnie, can you please take this? Because people knew that there was a story there, but they also knew they didn't really know the contours of it, and they didn't want to get it wrong. And so I think a lot of what reads to evangelicals as media bias against us is either people are ignoring it because they know they can't cover it well, or they're trying to cover it and doing a bad job because they just have no cultural familiarity there. And so, especially having been to seminary and having that deeper knowledge of the faith and a little bit of a bigger sense of sort of the church in America beyond just one's own tradition, which it's very easy to think if you're just a lay person in the pews, to mainly be familiar with your own church. That and like that bigger perspective, and then coming into an industry where it's just increasingly a secular population of journalists. It's not really like people are trying to not hire evangelicals. It's that no evangelicals are applying.
That's a very candid assessment, Bonnie. It's a call for kind of this presence relationally, and even in terms of the ideas, making them present and available. But you also speak to this deep notion of the truth that's out there in your writing, and or in this case, the untruth. So your recent book, Untrustworthy, The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. That's a mouthful. You've tackled a lot in that.
I did that to myself. That was
yeah. Let's break that apart a bit.
But yes, that was my doing.
What is the knowledge crisis that you're referring to?
Yeah, so it's that sense, I think, that is really familiar to many of us, maybe all of us, if we're talking about people who have self-selected to listen to this podcast, but that sense of unease and uncertainty about what is true, what is knowable, what voices are trustworthy, that I think we increasingly feel when we are consuming media. And I would say especially news media and social media, and especially online, but not exclusively. And I would also say especially political media, but again, not exclusively. I think it's bigger than just, we sort of think about like, well, the problem is political stuff on the internet, and it is that, but it's not just that. It's just that sense of like, you don't know really what you can grasp. There's so much information coming our way all of the time. And to get slightly more technical, what I talk about in the book, and my agent and my editor both told me I absolutely could not put this word on the cover, and they were right. But it's what's called an epistemological crisis, an epistemic crisis, you could say. And epistemology is just the branch of philosophy that has to do with knowledge, with how do we acquire knowledge, how do we distinguish between fact and opinion and belief, and those are questions that I think many of us are not accustomed to thinking about routinely. That in other eras we did not have to think about routinely. But because in large part of the rise of the internet and the fact that we all carry the whole internet in our pockets all of the time in our cell phones, so much information, so many truth claims come our way that I think we have to have some awareness of epistemology and of the way that we are encountering knowledge. Because if we don't, we have an epistemic crisis, a knowledge crisis, that uncertainty that I've spoken about.
Yeah, Bonnie, part of the knowledge crisis that you're highlighting is the sheer volume of information and our inability to categorize it well, or to even know what to trust within that sheer volume. I wonder if there's a deeper problem, not only in the volume, but what we even understand as truth or legitimate sources of knowledge, how we think of experts, for instance. I mean, are you seeing not only the quantity of information as being overwhelming and therefore breaking us, but also qualitatively, like how we sort through information, what we count as true?
Yes and no. The reason why I emphasize the quantity so much is that, there's always been lies, right? There's always been deception. I think the difference was that in eras past, maybe you came across 2 lies about the state of the world a week because, you're waiting on the newspaper that takes a week to ship from New York City, right? I recently read about some communities in Minnesota in the 1800s, and like the rival newspapers would arrive once a week, and it was so exciting, and they all sat down to read and debate. That's just such a different pace of information coming your way. And when you have that smaller quantity, it gives you more time and more resources to assess the quality, and to really think about that and really can say to yourself, is this true? Whereas when it's just constantly streaming past you, you don't have time to sort through things. You don't have time to think about quality. You don't have, most likely, the expertise yourself to assess just the sheer number of things coming your way. And so, yeah, there are quality issues for sure. But the reason why I don't think it's so fruitful to speak, as many people have in the last few years, about disinformation or misinformation, is I think because of the situation in which we find ourselves, I think we are mistaken to focus so much on the quality of the knowledge out there, or the quality of the information out there that is claiming to be knowledge. A journalist who I quote in the book says the issue is not the beliefs, but the believers. That does not work in Christian spaces. So I would rephrase it to be the issue is not the knowledge, but the knowers. We have to assume, I think, that there is going to be bad information out there all of the time in high volume for the rest of our lives. And so what I would encourage people to think about is themselves as receivers of that information, rather than think, maybe we can do something about the quality, because unfortunately we can't.
The overwhelming nature of it, the sorting of it, doesn't necessarily lead to breaking, polluting, corrupting. I mean, it could lead to a sense of being overwhelmed or feeling anxious or tentative in how to sort it. But you use stronger words. Why is it breaking us?
Yeah, I think the justification for those words is that we are not handling it well. And I think a big part of it is how really quite quickly we got into this situation. I mean, when I was in high school, I was still using like a rotation of AOL free trial CDs to have internet access, and it was dial-up, and it made the screechy noise, and I could barely do anything. And that's not that long ago, that was sort of the way that we encountered the world. So things have changed very rapidly, and I think especially because thinking back to like the 2008 election, which was the first big social media election, we had a lot of optimism about the internet, and we thought this greater flow of information and this greater connectivity and new ways to converse with one another, we thought that this would be a positive thing, that this would be good for democracy, that we would be more informed. And so I think we were caught off guard by how overwhelming it was, how much of it was poor quality, and we just didn't really prepare ourselves. And so it's not that we can't handle ourselves well in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, it's that we haven't. And we have allowed our uncertainty, and in many cases, not just uncertainty, but also fear and anger and accusations to change how we think about each other, to change how we interact with one another, to interfere with longstanding relationships. And so I do think that it is not an exaggeration to say that, yeah, even in many cases, our patterns of thought, our minds are different. The way that we are engaging with one another inside the congregation, inside the church house. And then obviously, I don't know that I need to make a case for our politics having a problem. That one seems like an easy sell.
So, yeah, the church, you're saying that it's not merely something that's polluting our politics, which we all sense deeply, particularly at this time period, the conflicting nature of what has happened in our political situation. But you're saying that something is actually seeping into the church. And what is that?
Yeah, so I think as Christians, we think of ourselves as people of the truth. We ought to have some sort of, special understanding of the truth, right? But the fact is that we don't actually seem to be much better on this kind of thing than our secular counterparts. And in fact, there's some polling, and I don't have the numbers ready to hand, as it's been 3 years since I was writing this book. But there's some polling that suggests that evangelicals may be even more susceptible to unjustified, like, conspiracist thinking than other Americans. And there are reasons for that, reasons that are like sympathetic and make sense. But the fact is that we don't necessarily have a better handle on our information environment than other people, and we don't necessarily have to have knowledge of like the capital T truth doesn't necessarily make us experts in lowercase t sort of truths out there in the world, right? If I had to to describe what it looks like in our churches, though, I think the thing that always comes to mind for me is, again and again, as I was researching and writing this book, I would come across like this near verbatim statement from pastors. I saw it in the wilds of social media. People said it to me. I saw it in where pastors had said it to other journalists and their reporting. And it was basically, as a pastor, I get people an hour, 2 hours a week. But Facebook or Twitter or Fox News or MSNBC or talk radio, whatever their preferred medium of choice, gets them 10, 15, 20 hours a week. And I just can't compete. And what they meant was competing for discipleship and for forming people's lives and forming their thoughts and their ways of being in the world. And that sense that pastors had over and over again, I think, is really core to the way that this knowledge crisis affects us in our churches, because even if we're still showing up in the same place week after week, if it is by portion of our time and investment and the shaping of our thoughts so much smaller than these other influences, that can't help but have an effect over time. And that can't help but, if a conflict, say political, for instance, and I'm sure many people are facing this right now, if a political conflict comes up within a congregation, the balance of your time and thought at that point has been spent on your politics, which are different from this fellow congregant, not on your faith, which is the same.
So this discipleship, and just the sheer amount of time that we're formed by forces, influences outside of that, deeply rooted in Scripture or communal life together, it's almost an unfair combat of ideas if it's shaped in that way. You said something that I want to pick up on about expertise, the difference between a capital T knowledge of the truth of Scripture, of God, of navigating the world as followers of Jesus, and then the lowercase t. Draw that out a little bit. What are the implications that difference has for how we would, even if we had the hour together, how we would go about navigating, translating the capital T truth to the lowercase t issues that face us?
That's the $1,000 question, right? I think this is where we always have to have a certain amount of grace for each other, because how we make that translation is going to vary widely, and it's going in many, maybe most cases, to be legitimately debatable among people of faith acting in good faith. I do think that expertise is in a particularly difficult place in our society right now. And I would say right now, because I think it has really shifted for the worse in the post-pandemic era. Many experts, which I would say in terms of both having specific knowledge and also having positions of power, did not comport themselves very well during the pandemic. And there was a lot of noble lies, and there were a lot of do as I say and not as I do, a lockdown order, and then the governor's out to dinner, these kinds of things. And there are, we absolutely need to give experts the ability to correct themselves and to make mistakes in public, and to understand that you can have real expertise in an issue and not have real expertise in public communication, which is a wholly different thing. But one way or another, even if you're aware of all those caveats, which I don't know that many people are thinking that way, one way or another, the whole concept of expertise, I think, has taken a real hit. And this too is part of our internet era, right? The idea that anyone can go online and do their own research. It's not like research though. It's like watching YouTube videos that fit with what they already want to think. And what I've tried to emphasize for people is, as much as you can point to officials or whomever who are experts and didn't do a good job at it, we all actually trust expertise all day, every day. I think every time you drive across a bridge, you are trusting the expertise of people you've never met and people whose expertise you have no skill to evaluate. And we all have to trust experts to live in a society as complex as ours. And so I think we have these front of mind examples of expertise being distant and untrustworthy. But in reality, like, we need expertise. We have to trust it to function. We do trust it. And I think it can be useful to remember those kinds of expertise instead of just the failures of expertise that may loom large. And that requires a certain humility. It requires remembering that, our own expertise probably exists and is probably limited. And try to have a certain patience with experts in other things, and an appropriate level of trust, just as we would hope that they would have patience and an appropriate level of trust in our expertise areas.
I'm curious if the fact that in some ways we can all be experts because we have access to a wide range of information. Now we have platforms through social media that we can project ourselves as an expert on something, whether it's the influencer that, seeks to project expertise in a particular area. What's the impact on that of self-proclaimed expertise on the ability even then to trust what you're hearing from the pulpit or from other thinkers? It seems that it's not just a matter of competition then, 1 hour versus 10, 20 hours, but there's a shift in how we understand expertise that seems to suggest the possibility then no one's an expert because everyone's an expert. So why should I trust anyone?
Yeah. I mean, again, I would reiterate that in practice, we do. We may express those kinds of doubts, right? But you're going to let a surgeon cut into your abdomen, not just any rando on the street who claims they've done their research on the internet. So in practice, I think as much as we express these doubts, that's not quite how we operate. But I also think that this, multiplication of voices claiming expertise and often claiming it, I would say, illegitimately, or at least, with insufficient study. I think it's a good case for something that I often recommend to people, which is really just limiting the number of things that you sort of pay attention to in the public sphere. I'm not talking about like, don't look for expert advice when you're trying to decide what doctor to get, right? Like those sorts of things that affect your concrete private life. But thinking about as you're consuming news, we have this idea that sort of everyone should have a broad surface level knowledge of the news of the day. And I recommend strongly against that for most people. For people who are sort of like political hobbyists and like to keep up with stuff and it's fun for them, have at it. But for people who are just trying to be responsible about a few things, I think it's far better to pick at most half a dozen issues to know really well on a long-term basis, and with a depth that lets you come to develop some of your own expertise on those topics and to find out who are the real experts in that issue. And that is something that can only come with time and, reading perhaps a book on the issue, not just some random news report every 10 days. I think that kind of focus of our attention and acknowledgement that we have finite time and resources and mental capacity helps us to sort through some of that proliferation of voices seeking our attention.
So some of this all contributes to the rise of conspiracy theory. I'm going to circle back to something you said earlier, that maybe there's a proclivity, susceptibility of evangelicals toward conspiracy theories, whether or not that is true. Break down for us, what are the factors that would lead anyone, evangelical or otherwise, to fall prey, be victim to a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that I would note, and this will sound a little bit pedantic, but hopefully it makes sense, is I don't think it's so useful to speak of discrete conspiracy theories. And the reason is that sometimes conspiracy theories are true. I think the vast majority of cases they're not, but sometimes they're true. And especially for people who came of age in the 1970s, there were a lot of official reports out of Washington exposing, actual conspiracies. The thing that troubles me much more than someone's belief in a discrete theory, which might be true, which might be false but harmless, is sort of a broader mindset of conspiracism, which I would describe as something that's at once very, very suspicious of but also very credulous, right? So very suspicious of people and ideas that they are already inclined to disagree with, but very credulous of anything that fits their preconceived narrative. And I think that's what we've really seen an increase of in the last few years of American politics, because America has always had lots of conspiracy theories, and I think we always will. But that mindset of sort of broad suspicion and at the same time credulosity, that does seem to have increased. As for why people would fall into that pattern, I think the single biggest thing is it feels like you are doing something good for the world. It feels like, and Christians, I think, will often layer this into an attitude of like you are serving God's purposes, God's plan for humanity. Because the basic narrative, whether we're looking at a single theory often or this broader mindset, is there's this group of people, or in some cases people would add spiritual forces, plotting evil. You know the truth about it. You are spreading the truth, or maybe taking some other steps to stop that evil thing. Maybe in the process, you're, advancing God's kingdom or hastening Christ's return, or whatever the exact thinking may be. And why would you not want to play this heroic effort to stop this evil thing? Like that's very attractive, right? Who wouldn't want that? A distinct thing in the modern like digital era, I think that is also a major factor, is we tend to think about conspiracy theorists in sort of the X-Files, like Mulder's in the basement and he's got the big chart and he's like going alone and he's meeting people in parking garages and they're giving him secret documents. We think about conspiracy theorists as sort of a loner. But what the internet has really made possible is doing conspiracism together in a community. And so it's not just that you're opposing evil and you are working for good, you're doing it with your friends and like you're hanging out and you're talking. And again, what's not to like? And I think especially in our era where everyone's talking about the crisis of loneliness and you see these really devastating polls come out about how few people even have like one person they would consider a good friend. If there are all these folks online who think the way you do and they want to hang out with you and they want to chat, like that's very attractive. And I think that it's normal to get excited about that, and it becomes understandable why people get sucked in and why it can become such a dominant part of their lives if that becomes their dominant community.
Yeah, you really speak to the issue that we're not just brains on sticks. We're not just individuals responding to ideas, that ideas have communal implications. They either foster certain types of social connections or break down social connections. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So, it's really fascinating and pulls together a lot of things that we've been talking about in another series that we have, Difficult Conversations podcast series. And the series features real stories about people who have misperceptions about each other, disagreements, maybe even a sense of disgust for the ways that the other person navigates or the other community navigates lives. But yet there's also this deep yearning that you've touched on for human connection, for ways that we could do this better, to love one another better, certainly within the Christian community, but also as a part of our witness as Christians toward the broader society. That really seems like that's a countercultural move. Do you explore some of the positive elements of peacemaking and what do we do with this in your work that's beyond the breaking of brains and polluting? Like, how do we put this stuff back together again?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I talk about in that vein is that many of us, if we have, for instance, a loved one who we think is, beginning to be confused in their thinking about politics or the media or what have you, or if we have some of this dissension going on in our church, or we think someone's falling into conspiracist thinking, I think many of us, our instinct, and I know this is my instinct, is to try to like argue the case on the facts with them, right? Like, let me explain what's wrong with how you're thinking. Let me, tell you better news sources to read. There were a few years there where every Thanksgiving people were coming out with arguments about like how to argue with your racist uncle at the Thanksgiving table, because the middle-aged men of America are going to change their thinking because some 18-year-old tried to like show them up in front of all their family. And I increasingly just think that that kind of head-on approach with someone who is not a willing conversation partner on the subject, that is not going to get you anywhere. I think in many, many cases, it's also just addressing the wrong thing. It's missing these communal interests and these sort of deeper needs and reasons that people are behaving in ways that we think, are incorrect or wrong or whatever the case may be. I also think that we need to consider carefully, is my objection that I think this other person has a bad idea in their head? Or because, we all have wrong ideas in our heads. And sometimes that's like, first of all, it's just part of the human condition. We all have errors and mistakes. But is it actually like harming anything? Is it destroying relationships, right? Does it rise to the level of corrupting Christian community? In many cases, I think it doesn't. It's annoying. We wish it weren't that way, but it's not actually that big of a deal if it's not really bearing bad fruit in their lives and in the community. And so rather than going at that sort of head-on approach, I think it is much better for them and frequently for us, because I think frequently, when we put ourselves in that position of thinking like, I have the correct ideas and I have the good media consumption habits and I'm gonna, I don't have a knowledge crisis. That when we put ourselves in that position, we don't realize that we may be dealing with some of the same things and we have our own blind spots. And so I think the best thing for all parties is really to be focused on the broader relationship, the relationship as siblings in the faith, the relationship as family, as friends, whatever the case may be, and redirect our attention. You can't do church 20 hours a week. We're not going to have 20 hours of sermons to compete with that 20 hours of Twitter. Right. But you can have people over for a potluck. You can go for a walk and talk about like your kids and your dogs. There are ways, I think, to retether ourselves to that real world relationship that is not so concerned with these distant things. And maybe that will eventually lead to an opening where you more directly confront your disagreements. But also maybe it won't, and maybe that's okay. And that's something that we can leave to God to be working on and addressing, perhaps in ways that we don't even know about.
Yeah, it takes a lot of wisdom and self-discipline to be able to select, is this really worth it? Not every error needs to be corrected in the present moment. I'm certainly thankful that God does not convict and change and confront every single sin or flaw in my life, like right now at this moment.
You'd have to take a year off work immediately after getting saved to just like, it's all happening.
And Jesus, I mean, that's his approach with the Samaritan woman. He just begins with this innocuous question, will you give me something to drink? Even if he knows ultimately he's going to be talking about issues of eternal life. So that kind of wisdom is often so lacking in the ways that we go about things. And you've already given us some tracks to run on of relationship building, more broadly speaking. What would you say is if you were to summarize your big concern for the moment with respect to the church or Christians' faith, what would you say is the big concern?
I think I would go back to that question of what is primarily discipling you and primarily shaping how you're seeing the world and your fellow Christians, and how are you spending your time, and what do you think it accomplishes? Because there are so many things that we can be doing in our day-to-day lives that does accomplish some concrete good. I gave an example in a relatively recent article that I could continue like reading about some issue that I will never be able to influence because it's in Washington and I have no power, or I could go like make the meal train meal that I signed up to do for a woman in my church who has cancer. And like, what should I spend my time on? It seems very, very obvious I should go make the meal and not be on my phone reading about this issue I can't affect. And I say that as someone as like it is my job to know about these issues in many cases, right? And for many of us, we don't even have that extra layer of connection. And so I think just examining more carefully how much we go along with the default time use habits of our culture, which says that always being on your phone and always being so aware of everything that's happening in the world, maybe that's not actually the best. There's this really, I think, convicting C.S. Lewis quote that I share in the book, and it comes from, I believe, one of his letters. And it's something to the effect of, I think every village you should worry about your own problems there. And that it's not actually your responsibility to worry about some distant thing that you can't affect. And that often that may even become an excuse to ignore the concrete need in front of you that you could do something about. And, he was writing this, I forget if it was during or relatively recently after World War II. So it's not as if he had no notion of, faraway suffering and sometimes doing something about that, right? He wasn't advocating sort of this absolutist approach where you would never read the news or you would never pay attention to anything far away. But as a matter of course, what are we doing with our time? What are we doing with our minds? And how are we letting those patterns of life in our thinking and our behavior affect our relationships in our families and in our congregations?
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting that Jesus, when he lays out his commission to send people out to the nations, in Acts 1, he talks about, well, begin with your Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria,
and
then
then the ends of the earth.
Yeah. So you're really pushing us to be local, be very present. Because of the onslaught of information that you've talked about, it's so overwhelming. Let's reduce it to in the moment. If you sense you're about to go down a rabbit trail of being just swallowed with this, well, what question, what is one simple thing that we could develop as a practice to help us in that particular moment? I can't pull out 10 steps. I just need
one simple thing.
Simple thing, a question or a simple practice.
Read about it tomorrow if you still care. I think very often you won't. And I think very often there will be better, if it's like some breaking news, there will be better information available by the next day, right? Because journalists will have had time to actually collect something more reliable. And maybe it's not tomorrow, maybe you wait until next week. Whatever the case may be, set an alarm for yourself. And if you really want to, you can come back to it. But a lot of times, I think just that simple delay, it casts everything in a new light. And it's oh, I didn't need to do that.
Bonnie, as we near the end of the conversation, I'd love to invite you to give us a word of hope, encouragement, to be peacemakers in this, to discover what is true, to pursue the world as Jesus has called us to pursue it, and to be the way that we are called to be. What is the word of hope that you would give to us?
Yeah, I debated this. When you sent along that question, I debated it. I think what I would say is it feels and has felt, especially in the last 8 years of politics, like things are changing so rapidly. And as we've discussed at length, the information environment is so overwhelming. And it feels like we, have some compulsion to act or to do something in ways that are often, not actually available to us. There's often very little we can actually do. But I guess what I would say is, even amid all that sense of chaos, our responsibilities and the hope and love that is available to us in our local church is the same that it has always been. The responsibilities and resources there are the same. And even if those particular people seem extra difficult and annoying right now, there's a constancy and a sameness about the church. And the writings of the Christians who have gone before us, who have dealt with issues and problems that are more like what we are experiencing than it may seem, despite these technological differences and these surface differences. Those are all still available to us, and prayer is still available to us, and scripture is still available to us. So yeah, I guess I would just emphasize that constancy, even if it seems like our era is particularly chaotic.
Our guest on today's conversation has been Bonnie Kristian. I'm Walter Kim, and on behalf of us all, thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.